I've been collecting information on Mount Moriah for 6 months, but I never felt I had enough because there were just too many unanswered questions. Well, most of the questions are still unanswered. And so I decided to go ahead with the presentation anyway and change the name of it from the history of Mount Moriah to the mysteries of Mount Moriah. So perhaps we'll leave you with more questions than answers, but anyway, I hope that this talk tonight will provoke further discussion on this subject, and hopefully some answers might surface from any source. I plan to continue my search also. So let's begin the mysteries of Mount Moriah. Let me ask first, when we first getting started here, how many present are members of the York Rite? Okay, well, that's quite a good representation. We're going to be talking about a York Rite temple in our city, which is a part of McAlester Masonic history, but now lies in ruin. Of course, the name was Mount Moriah. I know you're familiar with the organization of the Scottish Rite, our organization, in that we have 4 lodges that span the 29 degrees. As a reminder, they are the Lodge of Perfection, which is what this organization here is. And then we have the Chapter of Rose Croix, the Council of Kadash, and the Consistory. Those 4 basic organizations covered all 29 degrees in the Scottish Rite. At one time, at least until 1967, these lodges were semi-separate entities, and the masters of these lodges were the governing body of the valley. As mentioned last month, a candidate could even, back in the early days, could even elect to join the Lodge of Perfection, which would be the 4th through the 14th degrees, and then delay the others until a later time. There was enough separation between these entities in the Scottish Rite. Through the years, and particularly after 1967, the Scottish Rite has nearly eliminated these individual operations of the lodges and operates now pretty much as a single autonomous organization. Really, the only option for candidates now is to join all 29 degrees at one time under the control of a director of work. Now, I've gone through this, which you knew about, but I tried to set this up to give you a perspective of the York Rite organization. The York Rite it has 3 divisions or subdivisions, just like the Scottish Rite has 4. They have the Chapter of the Royal or Arch, the Council of Royal and Select Masters, and the Commandery of Knights Templars. Through the years, and particularly after 1967, as I mentioned, the Scottish Rite has pretty well eliminated these individual operations. The York Rite is leaning in that direction now, but still maintain the separate and distinct subdivisions. In the early years, the distinction between these subdivisions was quite strong, and even to the point of having their own buildings and own temples. I will expand on this point in just a few minutes. Now I want to refresh your memory regarding the beginning of Masonry in this area. Craft or Blue Lodge Masonry arrived in McAlester in 1877 as the 9th Lodge in the newly formed Grand Lodge of Indian Territory, 1877. McAlester consisted at that time of just a small village of less than 200 people. And these people lived in an area that surrounded J.J. McAllister's trading post. They were mostly white, as the Indians preferred the isolation of outlying areas and farms. 1 year later, just 1 year later, 1878, a group of master masons received a dispensation to begin a chapter of Royal Arch in this small village, and by 1880, 2 years later, they received their charter. Now, this charter was the first York Rite venture in what is now considered the state of Oklahoma. So the Royal Arch chapter of McAlester is the mother chapter in the state. Legend has it that the Blue Lodge and the Royal Arch each had their own meeting place. This, of course, was in North McAlester, what we call North McAlester now. The Blue Lodge met in a frame structure on the east side of Main Street, east side, and the York Rite met on the west side. Both of them were frame structures at that time. Again, legend or word of mouth, primarily from Monty Hendricks.
That would be a legend.
That's a legend, yeah. After a few years of operation of these two lodges, the York Rite, for some unknown reason, was afraid that their building was going to be taken from them by higher officials. Perhaps they had got crossways with their grand officers. Anyway, they decided to deed over their building, the Royal Arch building, to the Blue Lodge, with the provision that they could continue to meet there. And I'm sure there was not a problem there, because as the same people pretty much were active in both the Royal Arch and the Blue Lodge, so they could handle that in pretty good order. Continuing on with the early day Masonic activity and their meeting places in McAlester, we find that due to the arrival of South McAlester, another Blue Lodge appeared in 1895. This lodge, the lodge room was located in the upper floor of what we now know as the west side of the old Hunt Store building. It was designated Lodge number 81 in the Grand Lodge of Indian Territory. And then that changed to 96 after the two territorial Grand Lodges consolidated in 1909. Now that same area up there in the upper floor of the Hunts building was the area that housed the Pittsburgh County Courthouse and offices after statehood in 1907, and until later on, until the remnants of the Busby Hotel was changed over to the courthouse that we know it now. In 1901, the Scottish Rite arrived in McAlester in the form of the Lodge of Perfection, of course our first organization, 4th through the 14th degrees. They met at that time in Lodge 81 location, and were about to go out of business when William Busby arrived, and you know the story of that. We've been over that before. As you know, they built a wood frame building, the Scottish Rite, in 1904, and by 1907, all 4 bodies of the Scottish Rite were chartered and operating in a new 3-story red brick building, nicknamed by me as the BB Temple. Of course, that stands for Busby's Baby, and boy, it really was. The reason for this long background was to give you a perspective of how the groundswell, or Tsumi-like a wave of Masonic activity, was in place here in McAlester in the early years of the 1900s. Everything was growing, including Masonry. For example, let's zoom in on the years 1906 and 1907. As mentioned, the red brick Scottish Rite Temple had just been completed. The Knights Templar building, which you know, as you can see by your charts there, if you're not York Rite, the Knights Templar building had begun construction, and what old timers now refer to as the Montgomery Ward building is still really, if you see the label up on the top of the building, it's labeled the Knights Templar. And they built that structure with the intention that they would have the upper floor as their meeting room, and the lower 2 floors would be rented out for income. And that's exactly what happened. And by the way, the first tenant for those folks was the J.B. McAlester Hardware Company. Anyway, Directly across the street then from the Templar building, the new Busby Hotel had just been completed about a year before. So the coal mines were really getting to be big business, so the whole area was booming. Commercial activity and Masonic activity too. This was the State of the Union and helps us understand how and why Mt Moriah came into being. After the Knights Templar group had decided to build their own new meeting place, the other two subdivisions of the York Rite, the Arch and the Council, this chapter and the Council, started to look around to do the same thing. They gained access to a small acreage west of town from the Choctaw tribe in 1907. It was described in a newspaper article as a stubby knoll of grassland. I don't know how big an acreage they had, but they began to make plans to build a temple out there. As a first step, they buried a vault deep in the ground and placed in it records of the McAlester chapter and council and other memorabilia of the York Rite. Within a year, this land was legally condemned and became part of a very large acreage that was assigned by the new state of Oklahoma legislature to be the site for a new penitentiary. Thereafter, their enthusiasm lagged for a little bit, but we now come to one of the many mysteries of Mt Moriah. The reference book of Oklahoma, south of the Canadian, states that this new temple was begun in 1912 and completed in 1913. However, I have in my possession other articles which indicates this can't be true. Baird Martin, writing in a Consistory News article in 1988, stated that the building of this new temple, which became Mt Moriah, was dedicated in 1917. However, this is questionable, as I stumbled on to a 1949 article in a special section of the News Capital commemorating McAllister's 50th anniversary, which stated that the construction on Mt Moriah actually begun in 1908 and continued on through 1914. From other dated photos that I have, this seems to be the most logical time period, or perhaps even after completion of the buildings in 1914, they continued on to add improvements and maybe held a grand dedication in 1917. Well, these are all question marks, but at least we do know that from all of this, trying to pinpoint the exact beginning and completion date, we can conclude it took place sometime in this general period of the 19-teens, early 19-teens. We do know that a building committee was appointed as follows. E.T. Richards, who, by the way, this picture's right up here, and he's got his York Rite cap on in that picture, and he's the one, his family is the one that's adopted this room, and so obviously he was an active Scottish Rite Mason too. But E.T. Richards, Chris Springer, Edmund Doyle, W.E. Voorhees, and W.M. Essex. These men were the original building committee. These men purchased 90 acres of land, both surface and minerals, approximately 2 miles north of Northtown. The original vault buried west of town was recovered and reburied in the new construction. The reason this site was selected was because the committee wanted the following conditions. They wanted their temple to be on a hill, not too steep a hill, so that they at least could build a road that would hold its shape. I don't think it ever did. A flat, at least a bit of a flat area or a tabletop on top of the hill for the construction. And they wanted it not too far from the city and not too close to the city, and definitely not inside the city. So this last requirement probably was their biggest problem in later years. The area selected had all these qualities, the one 2 miles north of Northtown. Baird Martin's account stated that the Union Council Number 3 was the governing body in charge of construction. That's the second area. The council was in charge of, but that the Royal Arch also was involved. As mentioned earlier, these were the other two York-Rite subdivisions besides the Knights Templar, who had gone ahead and built their own building. We know also that E.T. Richards, a member of the building committee, returned home in 1914 from a tour of the Holy Land with many new ideas for this new temple project. Now, the name Mount Moriah was selected. We don't know for sure why, but we can make some educated guesses. The name appears twice in the Bible. First, when Abraham was directed to a mountaintop in the district of Moriah, where he was to sacrifice his son, until being stopped, of course, by the Holy Spirit. Secondly, and probably more appropriately, Mount Moriah was said to be the location selected for Solomon's temple in the city of Jerusalem. You will recall that Solomon's temple had underlying tunnels and a secret vault. The committee's plan to finance the construction is another mystery. We do know that some donations came in. Were they adequate, or was there a mortgage to deal with in later years? Really, still don't know. I'll bet that we can find that out. That'll surface. They needed a William Busby to show up. By the way, records indicate that Mr. Busby was a York-Rite Mason in Parsons, Kansas before moving to McAlester. However, most of his Masonic activity in McAlester was with the Scottish Rite. I've read two different cost figures for Mount Moriah. One was $25,000 and the other was $28,000. Now, of course, you've got to recognize these are in early 1900 figures, which would be highly inflated from that figure in today's money. However, let's contrast that with the Scottish Rite temples that were built. The red brick temple, built in 1907, which was before the Mount Moriah, cost $90,000, considerably more. And then the current building, which we're in right now, which was completed in 1930, cost about $600,000. So really, the Mount Moriah project was just getting off the ground to what they really thought, and they only expended that much money. Now let me describe what Mount Moriah looked like. You've got pictures. If you haven't seen these, pass them around so that people can see the building consisted of two separate buildings. The only picture which we have, which is the one you have, I'm passing around, shows buildings. The picture belonged to E.T. Richards and was used in a News Capital article, and so I think you'll get a perspective of what it was. It wasn't one big building, it was two separate buildings. You will note that the caption states that this photo was taken in 1915, and the buildings appear to be completed, at least on the outside. So as best I can determine, there were two tunnels involved there was one from the lower building to the upper building, a distance of approximately 60 feet. And then the other tunnel was the one that went from the front to the back of the upper building. Both were used in the degree work. The upper building, called the Temple Room, was built to look somewhat like a Masonic structure. It had 4 columns on the front and was built in a little bit more of a fancy style. The lower building looked more like just a plain commercial brick structure. In the lower building, the brick structure, the dining room was on the upper floor and the lodge room was on the lower level. I would guess that the upper building was used by the council and the chapter activities were probably done in the lower lodge room. Just a guess, I don't know that. The Council of Royal and Select Masters is referred to as cryptic masonry and takes its name from the word crypt, which means a concealed place or a subterranean vault. Two of the council degrees, you'll notice on your chart there, two of the council degrees, the Royal Master and the Select Master, deal with the vault under Solomon's Temple. The grandiose plans was to make Mount Moriah in the image of the original lodge room in England, which utilized an abandoned mine on the site to portray the cryptic degrees. The original planners thought that Mount Moriah would give the candidate such a unique degree experience in the tunnel areas that thousands of York Rite Masons from all over the country would come to McAlester for that purpose, and that in the process would financially help adopt the project. Many outside Masons did come to McAlester in that manner in the first couple of years, but gradually the interest faded. Why? Another mystery. I mentioned the rest of the project, besides the two buildings. They had the vision of using all 90 acres in a landscaped park consisting of children's playgrounds, swimming pool with bathhouses, tennis courts, and other recreational facilities for use of visiting Masons in their pilgrimage to Mount Moriah. Of course, this never materialized. Even today, this seems to be a very ambitious plan, but if you think about it in the context of those years when Masonry was really blossoming, it was very possible. So what happened? We don't know. There was even a mention in a London newspaper article about this unique Masonic location in McAlester, Oklahoma. The article belonged to Mr. Richards also. As best I can tell, Mount Moriah was used on an active basis for only about 9 years. This would make the end of the life of Mount Moriah in the mid-1920s. So was the demise due to the lack of interest by either the local Masons or the hoped-for out-of-towners? Don't know. Was just the vandalism? They had a lot of vandalism out there. As I mentioned, it was out by itself. And evidently, they didn't have enough funds to keep full-time security out there. And consequently, you know what happened. The vandalism took place. So I suspect that maybe both lack of interest by the Masons and the vandalism too were both causes in the fact that they quit using it. With the arrival of the Great Depression years, all hope of reviving this lofty ambitions plan ended. I have a picture dated 1935, and pass this around and you can see it, which shows a large gathering of the Grand Chapter of the Royal Arch Masons. Grand Chapter, so that means a statewide meeting here in McAlester, and they were in front of the upper building of the Mount Moriah, and the caption says, "At the ruins of Mount Moriah." So this was 1935, so obviously the thing was in ruins. However, you'll notice the pillars are still in place, so it wasn't completely torn down like we know it now. In the years thereafter, because the structures were falling down, the roof fell in and so forth, the men who worked so hard to build this project had to go out and tear down the walls due to the liability factor of visitors. This ends my story. Not a history, but a story of Mount Moriah and its mysteries. History is a collection of fully supported facts. Since most of the statements here tonight were made in somewhat of a disclaimer manner, this can't be labeled history. You got to go with facts in history. So perhaps this feeble effort on my part will help bring to light some hard facts about this forgotten niche in McAlester Masonic lore. If I later receive any corrections to what I have reported tonight, I will return with a revised history, not a story. Thank you.